Say what is going on, guys? Void Hunter here, and welcome to today's video. And in today's video we are going to be ranking all of the main Star Wars films. Now, I want to start off this video by saying I wasn't exactly sure how to go about naming this video, as continuity for the animated films and the main Star Wars films work, albeit rather loosely, and I'm not all that sure if the films are as canon as the TV series that followed them, but it's still rather clear to me that the Clone Wars and Rebels TV shows are to an extent mostly canon to the main story, so for simplicity's sake, I'm going to be including them anyway. To give some guidelines for the ranking this list, I will deal with the 13 Star Wars movies, which include the 9 main Star Wars movies, the prequels, sequels, and the original trilogy, that is, the Solo and Rogue One Star Wars movies, and the 2 animated TV series launch titles, that being the Clone Wars movie and Star Wars Rebels: The Spark of the Rebellion. This will not include the holiday special, the Ewok specials, or any other side story movies I might have missed, as they are either not canon or I just haven't seen them myself yet. But maybe sometime in the future I can update this list to include them as some sort of ultimate Star Wars list if people really care to see a full Star Wars ranking video sometime. Let me know down below if you'd love to see that, or if you have any other ranking ideas or commentary-like videos like this in the future. I would love to see what you guys have to ask for. Right before we get into the rankings, I would just like to preface this video by saying this is only my opinion, and if your opinion differs at all, I'd like to know why and how you'd go about ranking these films. And obviously, this is going to be coming from a guy who has seen all these Star Wars movies before at least once, if not multiple times. So if you haven't seen them before or don't want to be spoiled, then I suggest clicking off this video and coming back once you have. And that is going to be your spoiler warning. But without further ado, let's get right on into this video. Now, going into number 13, we have The Rise of Skywalker. Now, I'll be straight up, out of all the movies on this list, this was the one that stood out to me as last place material the most. I'm not going to beat a dead horse here. Pretty much everything wrong with this movie, and more so the sequel trilogy as a whole, has been said 1,000 times, so I'm just going to sum up my thoughts. Well, this film looks great, and looks really good in visuals, and the fight on the Death Star 2 ruins was a nice opposing design to the Mustafar duel in Episode 3. The story and plot progression really kills this one for me. Palpatine returning really kind of finalizes the destruction of the original trilogy's victories, and it hurts very much for me to watch. I'm aware Palpatine was just a clone, but let's be honest. Considering how overpowered this clone was, I don't think it's that unreasonable to say he might as well have been the original. And while I'm glad they added the idea of Leia's Jedi training in the past, I think it really adds more to her character in kind of a bad way, as that lack of any action coming from her seems more selfish than it did before, when we knew that, when we didn't know that she was a Jedi. Nowadays, it just seems more like she just kind of doesn't do anything, and it seems very unlike Princess Leia. Also, her death was sad, and not in the emotional way I'd hope such a great character as Carrie Fisher's Princess Leia would have deserved. All she gets is a sheet over her corpse, while a bunch of side CGI characters cry, and honestly, it's kind of pathetic, to be honest. At least if Leia died in The Last Jedi, it would have been fitting to the brutal unfairness of war, but I guess they couldn't do that, I suppose. This movie spends too much of its time retconning the previous films or following Rey and the gang going on a quest for some random artifacts that don't matter at all outside of this movie, and especially not by calling herself a Skywalker. Not exactly a great send-off, if you ask me. The whole Force dyad thing was an interesting idea, but it feels like the only time it really had any payoff in this story was when Kylo had to sacrifice himself at the end for Rey to survive, which works against the film because Adam Driver's Kylo Ren in this movie, and to a larger extent the sequel trilogy, is, in my opinion, the best part without a shadow of a doubt for me. especially with his talk with Han Solo, his dad, that led into his redemption before the final act of the film. It really sticks true to me. I really like that scene, and a lot of other scenes with Adam Driver's Kylo Ren. Honestly, there's a lot of potential with the sequel films, and honestly, I think it's a crying shame that the final movie is the one that disappointed me the most. Now, moving right along into number 12, we have The Last Jedi. Now, I'll start off by saying I promise not all the sequel films are going to be dead last. That'll come a little further in. But going into the next spot of this list, we have The Last Jedi. What I'm going to do with this one is list the things that keep it from being higher on the list, and then get into why it's above Rise of Skywalker. For one, seeing what they did to Luke in this movie just kills me, because Luke was always the faithful one. He always had faith in his father, even though he had killed and hurt so many people, caused many a genocide, and hunted down the Jedi. And yet, he never once gave up on him, to the point where he would sacrifice his own life on this very belief. Contrasting that with the Luke in the sequel trilogy that only saw a small hint of darkness in Ben Solo and decided that in order to save the things he had once saved before, and the only way to go about doing that was to kill him right here and now in his sleep. Seems very convenient for the story, but unlike Luke as we had known previously. Everything about Luke in this movie just feels rather off, and while his death scene hit me like a truck in the theaters, it doesn't change what they did to him as a whole. And his force projection to me just feels very cowardly-like, going back kind of to that Leia thing I mentioned with Rise of Skywalker. Not sure what it is with the sequel trilogy and making the old cast seem like cowards. But anyway, it just doesn't seem like what Luke would actually do. Leia saving herself with the Force when it had made perfect sense for her to die when the bridge exploded had me very annoyed in the theaters, and still does to this day. Now, don't even get me started on those turtle speed starships that are apparently made of paper that are supposed to also be called bombers at the beginning of the film. And might I add that everything in this movie containing Rose or Canto Bight region just annoys me to no end. I was literally, the first watch through when this movie came out, I was just waiting for the next scenes to go back to the main plot. I did not care at all for either of those two things. Snoke is just an absolute joke in this film. And while he was a guy I was interested in more, almost as much as Kylo Ren, they threw him away. Just like they did Kylo Ren at the end of Rise of Skywalker. And it's a little bit disappointing, to say the least. The reason this film is higher than The Rise of Skywalker, multiple reasons I think. Not many though. The reason why it's above it is because of that jaw-dropping Holdo Lightspeed sequence at the beginning, or I guess the beginning towards like the middle of the Battle of Crait. And, it looks fantastic. I gotta say that. Even though it doesn't make a lot of logistical sense, I think it does look fantastic, and I never thought I'd see that in a Star Wars movie. And while the Battle of Crait is very reminiscent of the Hoth invasion and The Empire Strikes Back, I think the aesthetic and the color palette of that particular engagement I really enjoy. And honestly, from the point of the movie where Luke joins the battle to the end of the duel with Kylo Ren, I think it's actually really cool to me. Most of this movie, I think, has some of the same kind of problems as The Rise of Skywalker, but kind of to like a smaller and lesser extent. But I think for me, the color palette, the scene design, and some of the setup in the movie is overall better than The Rise of Skywalker, which is what makes it at our number 12 spot. Heading down into the next spot comes number 11 at the Solo movie. To be honest, I'm not really sure how to feel about this movie. On one hand, I think the acting is good, the visuals are good, and the plot isn't all that bad. At least if it isn't noticeable like The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker. But I think the reason why Han got his last name is pretty dumb. Like, the officer just says, okay, so you're by yourself, so your last name will be written down as Solo. And Han just kind of rolls with that for the rest of his life? Alrighty then. Darth Maul is also kind of a cool appearance, but let's be honest, it's entirely fan service. And there was no reason for him to stand up in that call and ignite his lightsaber. It just feels very fan servicey out of every other reference I've seen in a Star Wars movie. But I will say the prequel and Clone Wars fan in me definitely still found it really cool, regardless. Also, on a side note, I kind of get the feeling that Robot L3, that walking droid that spoke English with Lando, I feel like it's just a dollar store K2SO from Rogue One with the added and obvious social justice jokes sprinkled, kind of sprinkled into her character. Very side character-y to me, and kind of adds that agenda feel that I didn't want to see in this movie. But other than that, she was kind of a side character, so I can't complain all that much. Overall, I just kind of feel like this movie doesn't really justify its existence like Rogue One and the prequels do. This movie overall just feels kind of meh to me, and I can see this going a spot or two in either direction, up or down on this list, depending on your perspective, but honestly, for me, I think this is in a nice middle area between films that I would watch a lot and films that I would only watch maybe a handful of times. And I would say this movie is overall better than The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker by itself, which is kind of why I came in at number 10. But before we get into number 9, can I just ask, am I the only one that kind of feels that this movie has that kind of aesthetic that The Mandalorian had, even though it came out before Mandalorian? Am I just crazy? Let me know now. Let me know down in the comments. But moving on, right along into number 10, we have Star Wars Rebels, The Spark of the Rebellion. Coming down at number 10 is the Star Wars Rebels launch movie. This might be a bit of a hot take, but this is honestly a solid Star Wars movie to me. If we were talking about this movie a few years ago when I first saw this, I would have had this probably below Solo. But after rewatching Rebels and this movie as well, I've come to have a new appreciation for this series, and especially for this movie in particular. Ezra's character is smaller, scaled, and just less important to this movie, and also less annoying than he is later in the series by like season 4. And honestly, he makes relatively logical choices for being the character that he is, and I agree that I honestly think it's a nice setup for this show as a whole, the way this movie goes about doing that. Now, one of my favorite scenes in this movie is Obi-Wan's message to the Jedi Order and the Jedi Holocron that Kanan Jarrus has. I just kind of feel like there's a lot of built-in tension and sadness in this message, and especially when you come off the back of Revenge of the Sith, I'm always a fan of seeing Obi-Wan anyway. But I have to say, man, it was really, you can just feel it. I don't know how to explain it, except that you just kind of feel it. But again, the lead into the series is nice, and while this movie does feel overly PG, and the series as well, I think the character banter is nice as well. Which I know those two things weren't really related, but on the other note as well, I don't think the animation style is my favorite. It is definitely worse than Clone Wars in my opinion, but frankly, I'm not getting dragged down by that too much. This movie kind of ranked up here specifically just for how this movie's designed and the fact that it's relatively short, so you don't have to sit there for a few hours watching a movie you don't like. If you didn't really like it too much, it's basically only about 2 or 3 episodes long. But I still think this film deserves recognition for the dumb fun that it really offers, kind of similar to some of the scenes in the original trilogy, even if to a weaker degree. But I still think it should be noted either way. Heading down into number 9, we have the highest ranking sequel trilogy film in The Force Awakens. Now, I'll be the first to say that this movie wasn't the one I thought was even going to be close to number 9 when I first saw the trailers back all those years ago, and even to a bigger extent after the first launch. Of course, I definitely got all sorts of chills a few times throughout the film due to the fan service, but after that wore off, I wasn't exactly in love with this film. But after seeing this film a few times and playing the LEGO Star Wars game on my channel, I have to say it's definitely grown on me just a little bit. And I really appreciate this film for having all the potential that it had, and it was the one film out of the trilogy that really had us asking the most questions that could have really been used later. You know, like, who is Rey? Is she Force sensitive? Is Finn going to be a Jedi later in the films? The framework is all there. And while it wasn't really expanded upon in the later episodes that came out, I definitely like all the potential, even though they didn't use it. The Force Awakens just had the most potential out of all of them. And I don't think that can be stated enough. It still has problems, of course. I still find Rey's expert piloting not only questionable, but also a bit rude considering Han and Chewie have been piloting the Millennium Falcon for years. But nonetheless, also, Kylo's defeat is still very laughable to me, and even with the knowledge we have, that being his internal conflict, that wound he sustained from Chewbacca's bowcaster, and Rey's high yet unmastered power, it still makes it laughable anyway, because he's supposed to be well trained, and he still gets beat by someone who's never carried a lightsaber. But nonetheless, I can't even lie. That scene where Rey pulls the lightsaber away from Ren and starts up that Force theme gives me goosebumps every single time I see it. But to wrap up this placing, I have to say the watchability of this film is much higher in my opinion than the previous movies, though some of that might be because of the fact that it's a dollar store Episode 4 A New Hope, but that's just me. And I think that's why it's kind of perfect right here at number 9. Cutting the negotiations short, at number 8, we have The Phantom Menace. Now I've got to say, this film had a bad rap when it was released, more likely due to Jar Jar and the politics within the movie, but honestly, if you ask me, this is the introduction to one of the biggest conflicts in Star Wars canon universe after hundreds to maybe thousands of years of the Sith being in hiding. This film isn't supposed to be action, it's supposed to be plot driven, and it's supposed to be the beginning of that Sith movement I was talking about, which led into the Clone Wars, which then led into the Galactic Civil War that we're also familiar with the original trilogy. I think it's a setup film, and I don't think you're supposed to go into it kind of being like, this is all the action I'll ever need. So let me be the first to say that while the down parts of this film are not the greatest attention keepers, when I come into this film, I know it's a setup film. It's a setup film for Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, and a bigger extent in the entire Star Wars canon afterwards. And this all comes down to the epic final battle between Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and Darth Maul at Naboo, which also introduced audiences to the epic score from John Williams in The Duel of the Fates. Not only is this final battle great, but it has a bigger purpose to the larger story in the name. Duel of the Fates refers to the outcome of the fight. If Maul succeeds in killing Qui-Gon, Anakin grows up without the father figure he would have needed to avoid becoming Darth Vader. If Qui-Gon survives, he has the father figure he would know how to train and manage Anakin's emotions, as well as have the desire to do that. Unlike Obi-Wan, who would eventually grow to love Anakin as his brother, but would still nonetheless start off on uneven ground, and regardless would still kind of be lacking that guidance and training that Anakin specifically needed to grow. So while this movie is much better than people made it out to be in my opinion, and is definitely greater in the bigger picture of Star Wars, the final battle and the third part of the movie are good, but that rewatchability at the beginning to like the middle portion of this film hold it back from being better in my opinion, which is why it ends up in the number 8 spot. Rushing in and taking number 7 now, we have Attack of the Clones. Now, before you string me up in the Geonosian arena and leave me for food for the Acklay, hear me out. This movie is probably widely regarded as the worst Star Wars film prior to the sequel trilogy and the holiday special. So you might be asking why exactly it is that I put this film above films like Solo and The Phantom Menace, especially after I just spent the last few minutes deciding where The Phantom Menace should be and how it's a better film. Now, while I definitely admit Anakin is at his second weakest point in character portrayal in this film, and his scene with Padme, all of them are honestly absolute cringe. And while the dialogue as a whole in this film is relatively laughable in its down scenes, this film has a few things about it which I think overall make it better than The Phantom Apprentice. The Phantom Menace. Nice try there, Clone Wars. For one, most of the action scenes and set pieces in this movie are unique places that we've never seen in Star Wars film before, or even after in some cases. All of them are full of action, and there's attention-grabbing conflict throughout those scenes. Coming into this movie, you're greeted with the death of the Queen of Naboo in a terrorist attack. If you remember right, the Queen of Naboo was featured in the previous film, so it tells you right off the bat in this film that it is not going to be slow, and it's not going to start slow whatsoever. So let's just get right on into this. Obi-Wan and Anakin chasing Zam Wesell in the upper streets of Coruscant, comical, it's high-paced and gives you the first taste of live action in Anakin's recklessness, and those emotions that would cloud his judgment throughout the film, which would also become a large part of his character in the later Star Wars films, and content as a whole. Obi-Wan and his search for the assassin and the subsequent finding of Kamino into the duel with Jango Fett on the docks of Kamino. Can I just say interesting and also awesome? I remember how cool I thought Kamino was back in the day, and to this day Kamino is still one of my favorite Star Wars planets overall. Not to mention it gives you the introduction to Boba Fett and the family line, which would come in not super relevant, but still relatively interesting to know later. Attack of the Clones gave us our first shot of how people who aren't Jedi can actually defeat a Jedi, which back in the original trilogy was damn near unheard of. And honestly, Jango Fett, to an bigger extent, Tamora Morrison, the guy that voices him, grips my attention and remains the badass of this film until his death on Geonosis, which we will get into later. This also leads into the Slave One asteroid chase scene, which gave us the introduction to the most satisfying bomb and explosion sound probably ever in the seismic charge. Now again, while Anakin and Padme's scenes in this film are pretty awful, and the dialogue in those scenes is also holding it back from being a much better film, I feel they're pretty necessary for setting up the romance in the sequel, and the importance of Luke and Leia later in the films, I think, goes without saying. And I also want to say that I think those cringy scenes also help slow down the plot and the action between those scenes. It helps kind of make it so there's not so many action sequences in the movie that it doesn't oversaturate the audience with it. But I will still agree, it's awfully cringe. Now honestly, the whole final act of this movie is just awesome. Seeing Jedi deal with stronger beasts without their lightsabers, an all-out war between Jedi and droid alike, and then clones and droids, Jango Fett and Boba Fett scenes sprinkled in between, Obi-Wan and Anakin versus Dooku, and then seeing Yoda fight for the first time versus Dooku right after that as well. There's just so much epic conflict packed into this awesome movie on the sandy aesthetic planet that is Geonosis. And honestly, I love it. Personally, I just think overall this movie grabs my attention from start to finish much better than The Phantom Menace did. And there's never a moment that goes on too long that would have me wishing I was watching a different movie, unlike some of the other films on this list. Phantom Menace gets boring at times, and it can sometimes be hard to stay focused until that very third act of the film, which is why I put Attack of the Clones above it. But honestly, I've kind of dwelled on the Attack of the Clones for long enough, so let's just move right on in. Negotiating terms for surrender at number 6, we have the Clone Wars movie. What an absolute classic. The animation may not have aged well, but honestly the story and dialogue still hold up quite well to me, even now. This is the introduction to the amazing Clone Wars TV series, which would say, honestly, has some of the best Star Wars that Star Wars has to offer. This movie isn't any different with that, in my opinion. This is the movie where Obi-Wan and Anakin become brothers. This is where that begins, in kind of a video diary, in a way. With the introduction of Ahsoka Tano, we also get to see what it would be like for Anakin to become a teacher instead of just always being a student. He's not a master, but he is a teacher, at least. And their relationship gets built on throughout this film, and while this film doesn't by itself have nearly as much substance as the later parts of the series and into Rebels, this film offers the groundwork for that heart-wrenching episodes in Victory and Death from Season 7 of The Clone Wars, as well as Twilight the Apprentice from Star Wars Rebels. This is the framework for that. I can also say that I find it absolutely believable that this even happens in the first place. And also, Ahsoka being a Padawan and knowing the normal rules and regulations of the Jedi Order perfectly opposes Anakin's more unorthodox personality both in battle and in character, which typically go directly against the Jedi Code of Conduct, which we would come to see a few times throughout the movies, and more so in the series. Honestly, some of the way some of these scenes are shot as well kind of just scream iconic to me. Like that opening scene, which I believe was also in the trailers, where Rex asks, General Skywalker, "What's that plan of attack, sir?" And he just looks back at him and just says, "Follow me." Side note, this is the first time we also get to see Anakin actually take command of his own personal troops, which had been implied in 2005's Battlefront 2 as well as Revenge of the Sith, but it was never really shown in Clone Wars. The Attack of the Clones or the movies all that much. It was always just implied, which might also lead into some of his characterization in Revenge of the Sith. He's seen a lot of his own troops die, and I think it helps with that. That he's led an army. And also, having a Padawan that you eventually fall out with due to the situation that comes up in the Clone Wars, I think also helps characterize Anakin's turn to the dark side in Episode 3. Overall, Clone Wars and the Clone Wars movie help make Episode 3 a much better film. Even by itself, it was still a good film, but it gives just a little bit more context that you kind of need. A lot of the events in this movie are awfully, kind of self-contained. I'm pretty sure there's not really much of a mention of any of the places or battles in this movie, except, kind of in Battlefront 2's kind of throwaway dialogue where I believe Anakin mentions Christophsis. But other than that, there's nothing else in this movie that kind of shows up later. And honestly, going back to what I said back in the Star Wars Rebels part, it's also not a very long film, so you don't have to kind of full send, if it makes sense. You don't have to kind of sit there and watch a very long film. And you can still get enjoyment out of the film, but it's at a smaller degree. It's beautiful in bite-sized chunks, and that's what this movie is. It's a bite-sized chunk of a much bigger series. On a side note, before we move on, there's just so many iconic quotes and meme-worthy content in this movie, and honestly, I love it. And I wish more people would notice it. Entering the dark hallway of death at number 5, we have Rogue One. Getting into the top 5, we have the first side story of the Star Wars movie genre. Now, this was one of the only side story movies I enjoyed and still enjoy after my first watch. For a standalone Star Wars film, this movie does a good job at keeping the core features of a great Star Wars film. You have your dumb fun, intense action, sadness, references to previous or future content, and giving an existence. It has a reason for its existence. And considering this film's basis is on the creation of the Rebellion and the prequel to A New Hope, and that leading into the destruction of the Death Star at the end of A New Hope, I think it kind of goes without saying that this film does a good job giving reason to its own existence, unlike Solo. K2SO. Yeah, that guy. That awesome robot. He has to be one of my favorite characters in this film. He was a delight to watch, start to finish, and his lines were actually pretty funny in comparison to a lot of the lines in the films that came out around that time. A comedic badass like R2-D2 in his prime, for sure, and I appreciate that this film, especially for once, has no problem killing off the entire main cast by the end of the film, which is very different to most, if not all, Star Wars films. But honestly, considering how many films contain the heroes winning, it's a nice juxtaposition. And even though they all die, they do kind of succeed in a way, and I think it's a good way to make it so it's not some depressing dark film, but still makes it a complete opposition to some of the other movies. This movie kind of gives the Empire that kind of reputation that was always implied in the original trilogy, but never really shown without the help of either Vader or the Emperor. Now, while Jyn Erso isn't the greatest protagonist, and is probably one of the weaker characters in this movie for me, I feel like she doesn't really hold the film back all that much because of her importance in the bigger picture than she is by herself. I mean, her dad is the reason why the Death Star has the big incredible weakness that it had in the first place, so I think it kind of balances out in the end. And I have to say, the amount of times the characters in this film kind of had me chuckling and kind of making me like the characters was really good. They did a good amount of characterization in this movie, and they did a good job making those characters. Even though they were going to throw them away at the end of the film, I think some of these characters are better than even some of the characterization we saw in the sequel trilogy as a whole. This is just something that Ray didn't get, and it's kind of funny considering it was a one-time the movie thing, so it's a little bit sad. Also, speaking of sad, it was actually pretty sad watching the entire cast die. I mean, I'm not saying something considering a lot of random rebel/resistance troopers had that same kind of thing where you knew they were on the side that you were rooting for, but they still didn't really have that same emotional impact, and I had that kind of problem with a lot of some of the main characters from the sequel trilogy as well, besides the returning cast. So, the fact that I feel anything for these characters speaks volumes for how they did the characterization in this movie. This movie ranks as high as it does because of its impressive visuals, its balls in telling a standalone story that also isn't afraid to kill off its cast and have the heroes lose for once. And also, that tie-in with A New Hope and other Star Wars media as well just keeps it here at number 5. Lowering the deflector shield at number 4, we have Return of the Jedi. Coming in our next spot, we have the finale to the original trilogy. Now, I'm not sure that this is much of a surprise to a lot of people, as most people seem to consider A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back as better films overall than Return of the Jedi. But here's my reasoning for this, and also why this comes in so high on the list. This movie comes in as the worst of the original trilogy for its rewatchability by comparison to the other 3 ahead of this one. That is honestly all I can really say against this movie. Return of the Jedi is just awesome. Simple as that. Episode 6 wraps up the original story arc of Anakin Skywalker that made the prequels necessary in the first place. Without this movie, and to an extent The Empire Strikes Back, Anakin Skywalker would not have been nearly as interesting enough to warrant prequels and a whole TV series about his journeys as a Jedi Knight. You get to see Luke Skywalker take up the mantle as a Jedi Master, something that had been built up in the previous 2 films, and it's just satisfying to watch. I mean, you can feel the payoff as much as Luke could feel the good in Lord Vader. Not only that, but even as a standalone film, it's enjoyable. And on top of that, it's rewatchable. It has ties into other times and places in a galaxy far, far away besides just references to previous movies. This movie has its dumb fun, that intense action, that sadness, that loss, the struggle and victory. And it's not just any victory, but a well-deserved and earned victory. The things that this movie and the original trilogy balance very well, in my opinion. The kind of success that we as an audience can feel even if we aren't there ourselves. The kind of struggle that has you on the edge of your seat throughout the conflict and has you relieved at the end and celebrating when the war is finally won. This isn't the only Star Wars film to do that for sure, but let's be honest, that party on Endor at the end of Return of the Jedi has got to be the best and most satisfying endings to a Star Wars film to this very day. I don't think that's even much of a controversial take either. A beautiful conclusion to the story of the 6 films through and through. Turning off the targeting computer and using the Force in at number 3, we have A New Hope. My God, this is undoubtedly one of the most iconic Star Wars films out there, and probably also one of the most iconic films in cinema as a whole, beside maybe Empire Strikes Back. But honestly, in my experience, back in the days of television channels, this movie was by far played more. I mean, this practically got the Terminator 2 treatment, and if you know anything about how often they played Judgment Day over Terminator 1, then you'll know exactly what it is I'm talking about. I'll never forget how excited I'd be when there was borderline nothing interesting on TV, and I was thinking about how bored I was, and then I'd flip to just the right channel, and I'd be saved by a literal New Hope. This movie is beyond nostalgic for me. Between this movie and The Empire Strikes Back, this has to have some of the favorite Star Wars soundtracks, besides maybe Revenge of the Sith. The incredible famous binary sunset on Tatooine mixed with a beautiful score honestly gets me emotional. And I'm not embarrassed to say that either. Because of the beautiful track and the heavy nostalgia this theme has, I'm not surprised, and plenty of long-time Star Wars fans will agree and feel the exact same way as I do. And had that same kind of feeling come back when Luke returned in the end of Mandalorian Season 2. It just goes to show you that people love Luke Skywalker, and this theme is also a big part of that, I think. I mean, honestly, the Force theme is probably one of the most recognizable OSTs from Star Wars anyway, besides, maybe Vader's theme or the opening crawl theme, which, honestly, the whole Binary Sunset is like a perfect encapsulation of that. I mean, I can go on and on for hours about how much I love the last, 8 or so entries on this list for differing reasons, but to save time for a video that's already getting pretty long as it is, let's just run through the things that this movie does right. Oh yeah, just about everything. All jokes aside though, I see no continuity errors here. It's enjoyable from start to finish, you get an entire hero's journey, and this is the movie that started it all. Both for me and audiences back in 1997. Or 77, my bad. For a movie whose effects haven't aged well at all, and especially compared to the movies that would come after it, it still holds up as a great film overall, and I will gladly sit down and watch some episode 4 anytime. There wasn't any way I could put this at anything other than top 3. And I'm sure a lot of people, including myself, would say that A New Hope holds a warm spot in their heart as either a top 5 or a top 3 greatest Star Wars films of all time. Coming in at a runner-up spot and claiming to be your father, we have The Empire Strikes Back. Now, this is probably the most surprising film on this list for me personally. This film never had the same appeal to me as A New Hope did, and I always used to think that after the Tatooine portions in Return of the Jedi that Episode 6 was a better movie than Episode 5, but after all these years and a lot of maturing on my end, I've come to appreciate this film for what it is, and I recognize its strong suits and what makes it an objectively better film than A New Hope. For a lot of Star Wars movie rankings that I've seen, this film seemingly is most people's first draft pick for top spot, and I completely understand that. This movie is a faithful continuation of Episode 4 and acts not only as a great sequel, but a good bridge between Episode 4 and 6. This is one of the few Star Wars movies where the good guys also lose, for once. And on another note, we visit multiple planets that are not only memorable, but are breathtaking in their own ways. You have the cold, yet silent and serene snow planet of Hoth, the lively and haunting swamp in Dagobah, the luxurious and beautiful city in the clouds in Bespin. On top of that, we get to see Vader in his prime time in this movie. We get introduced to Yoda, who, very iconic Jedi is he. And, I mean, if that didn't sell you already, let me just give you 2 words. Boba Fett. Yeah, that guy. We even get that great ending shot in the finale, which has the crew looking over the galaxy, reminiscent of that Binary Sunset theme I was mentioning earlier, back in A New Hope. But with the added visuals of the beauty that is outer space and the galaxy as a whole. Every scene on Dagobah with Yoda, he's either one of the funniest characters in Star Wars or just drops knowledge after knowledge along with that iconic line after iconic line. The beautiful part about Yoda's quotes is they are a reminder to the audience as well. My favorite line in this movie has got to be for the quote from Master Yoda. Size matters not. Look at me. Judge me by my size, do you? And where you should not. For my ally is the Force, and a powerful ally it is. Life creates it, makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us, combines us. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. There's just so much packed into this quote that I could probably spend a whole video dissecting it and talking about how powerful of a quote it is in my opinion, and its applications to real life, and also how the Force is in reality, just not in the way you'd think or you'd wish it to be. But as long as this video is, I couldn't add another 30-minute segment to it, so while I won't be going over that much here, feel free to think about that on your own time, and let me know down in the comments below what you guys personally think of this quote and what it means to you, or If you guys would actually like to see me do a dissection video like that at some point, just let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this quote. And I mean, can we even forget the Yoda theme when he lifts Luke's X-Wing out of the swamp after that short and awesome scene? John Williams is an absolute legend, honestly. But I couldn't go to the top spot without mentioning Vader in Cloud City with Luke. Not only is the aesthetic in the Carbonite freezing room both scary and good looking at the same time somehow, but the way the fight moves from place to place just feels organic. Not just our artificially moving characters to the director's desired locations to drop iconic scenes like "I am your father." It feels organic, and it feels like it would naturally progress this way. And I mean, this has to have one of the most iconic plot twists in cinema's history, with that "I am your father" speech. As well as, if that doesn't tell you the reputation that this movie has, I urge you to go rewatch it, because it's objectively one of, if not the best Star Wars film out there. And finally, coming in at our top spot, and being yet another happy landing, we have Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Well, well, well. Now, this is where the fun begins, indeed. Episode 3 has it all. This movie balances that clunky dialogue and comedy of the prequels with the most epic lightsaber duels in Star Wars history, as well as the most important era in Star Wars history, and also Order 66 and the destruction of the Jedi Order and the subsequent birth of the Empire. This movie has everything. And this movie somehow manages to have Obi-Wan and Anakin versus Count Dooku, Obi-Wan versus General Grievous, Palpatine versus Yoda, and then Anakin versus Obi-Wan at the end of the movie, without somehow oversaturating the audience with action. Each of these duels on their own is some of the best duels in Star Wars history, and this movie is jam-packed with them. Alongside all the other incredible, important kind of plot developments, it just, somehow this movie balances that without feeling forced or rushed at the same time, which is the exact opposite to Rise of Skywalker. This movie checks all the boxes that every great Star Wars film has. An amazing third act? Absolutely. Balances dumb fun with deep emotional moments as well? Oh goodness, yeah. Epic space battle scenes? You mean the best opening in a Star Wars movie? Yes. Awesome lightsaber duels? Chock full to the brim with them in this movie. Memeable content? I mean, baby, this movie is the absolute goldmine for memes. Let me tell ya. When I was a kid, Episode 3 was my favorite Star Wars movie, and to this day, it still hands down is my favorite Star Wars movie. And I'm pretty sure it always will be. Even the clunky dialogue in this film doesn't hold back how awesome this movie is for me, from start to finish. At not one single point in this film does it drag on for too long, and every scene is engaging for me. I honestly don't even care that the prequels got a bad rap from a lot of original trilogy fans back when it first came out, because I never hated the prequels, and I still don't. If I ever start watching Episode 3, I have to finish it, and I will always be willing to watch it without a shadow of a doubt. I have no idea how Lucasfilm managed to have the most emotional points in Star Wars history in the same movie with the comedy that the prequels have, and still making it not feel out of place to each other. They have some kind of perfect synchronization and harmony to it. I don't know if that was on purpose or if it was just a stroke of luck, but it feels right at home here, especially coming off the back of the Clone Wars TV show and its characterization of Anakin and Obi-Wan. It feels right. All I have to say is, this film has Anakin versus Obi-Wan, which is one of, if not the best, absolute duel in Star Wars history. The saddest moments in Star Wars history, that being Order 66, which over the years has been told from multiple different perspectives, so if that doesn't tell you how great that Order 66 scene was, I don't know what is. And also that other sad moment, that being the ending to Anakin versus Obi-Wan's fight. I don't think you'll ever get a tearjerker much like that anywhere else in Star Wars, to that same degree. Also, the most amount of memes in a single Star Wars movie, I mean, come on. This is literally just Revenge of the Sand. One of the most thoroughly engaging Star Wars movies from start to finish. I am never bored in this film. Not once. As well as some of the most important moments in Star Wars history. I mean, you have the death of the Jedi Order, the exile of the remaining Jedi, Yoda and Obi-Wan, and then some. The creation of Darth Vader, the main antagonist from the original trilogy. The rise of the Galactic Empire, and the birth of Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia, and so on. This movie is like the pinnacle shift to everything, and it's all in one movie. To finish off the list, Episode 3 has one of the best overall soundtracks in Star Wars history as well. I mean, John Williams was awfully firing off on like all cylinders with this soundtrack, with some of my personal favorites being Anakin's betrayal, the Jedi Temple March theme, Anakin's Dark Deeds, Anakin vs. Obi-Wan, and of course, Battle of the Heroes. Revenge of the Sith comes in at my top pick as the best Star Wars film, and with that comes the end of the video. If you stuck with me throughout this whole ranking, I appreciate that more than you could possibly imagine. If you disagree with me at all, please let me know in the comments, and I'd love to know how you'd want to rank these films and why. I just want to see what you guys think. I want to be able to kind of interact with all my subscribers and viewers. It would just be a great change of pace for me, and I haven't been able to do that yet, so it'd be different, and I'd love to try it at some point. But until next time, may the Force be with you, always.